In May of 1921, after a sudden illness, a man named Paul Amadeus Dienach slipped into a mysterious coma that lasted an entire year. But as bizarre as this sounds, it wasn't the strangest thing that happened to Dienach. When the young Swiss teacher finally came to, not only was he perfectly fine, but he also seemed to have acquired a supernatural ability to predict the future. I know this sounds so left field, but frankly, Dienach's revelations after coming back from his coma are things that simply cannot be accounted for any other way. He spoke of things like a handheld box that brings pictures to life, in other words, an iPad. He also predicted quite a number of things that would happen a full century later, like our attempts to colonize Mars, and even nuclear wars. And this was all at a time when World War II hadn't even happened yet. If you don't believe in the paranormal, then the story I'm about to tell you might just shatter your worldview, so brace yourself. And if you do believe, well, you're going to want to hear this. Paul Amadeus Dienach was a Swiss-Austrian teacher born in Zurich with a deep passion for history and classical philology, that is, the study of the history of language. For the most part, Dienach's health was quite fragile, but even that couldn't explain the strange sleep he fell into one day. That fateful day, Dienach was going about his regular activities when he suddenly fell into a strange sleep, just like that. Startled, his friends and family try waking him up from this strange and sudden sleep, but nothing they do rouses Dienach. This freaks everyone out, so they quickly rush him to the hospital, where the doctor informs them that Dienach had slipped into a coma, even though upon physical examination, he couldn't exactly find anything wrong with him. For 14 days, Dienach remains in this coma-like sleep until he finally wakes up, much to the relief of his panic-stricken mother. Naturally, Dienach feels a bit disoriented, but other than that, he seems completely fine, and after a couple of weeks, he goes back to his normal life. Perhaps this was just one of those random weird things that happens to people every once in a while, right? Well, not for Dienach it wasn't. Because 4 years later, in May of 1921, Dienach would once again fall into this strange sleep. Only this time, it was after a brief illness. Just like the last time, his friends and family would try to wake him, and just like the last time, nothing they try works. So once again, they rush Dienach to the hospital, perhaps expecting that he would come to in a few days or weeks, just like he did the last time. Dienach doesn't. Month after month goes by, and Dienach is still unconscious. His mother even passes on while waiting for him to come out of this strange coma. But Dienach just never wakes up. Then one day in May of 1922, a full year after he slipped into his second coma, Dienach blinks and comes to. He's awake. Dienach's post-coma recovery is once again phenomenal. Sure, his muscles are weak from a whole year of non-use, but besides that, he seems perfectly okay. There's just one thing though. Post-coma Dienach seems off. He's not talking to his friends or his family or anyone. He's being cagey, and it just feels like he's hiding something. Could this be grief? He and his mother had a very close relationship, so waking up from his coma to hear that his mom died waiting for him must have broken him. Still, this seems to be a little more than grief. Dienach is gradually becoming a recluse, burying himself in manual labor during the day and spending his evenings with his nose buried in books about philosophy. The only person he speaks to now is his priest, which makes the situation even weirder, because before the coma, Dienach wasn't exactly what you would call a very religious person. In fact, he was gradually starting to become skeptical about religion. But then, after his coma, Dienach suddenly becomes very invested in religious and spiritual matters, talking to his priest all the time, and even suggesting to him that there was a whole lot about religion and the afterlife that the priest didn't know about. What those things were, though, Dienach wouldn't say. Anyway, a couple of months pass by after Dienach's strange coma episode, and he comes down with a bad case of tuberculosis. For months, the disease would persist and worsen until Dienach's doctors advised him to move to a more temperate city. This was in October of 1922. With no mother and no friends, Dienach probably feels like he no longer has any ties to Zurich anyway, so he picks up his belongings and moves to Athens in Greece, where he gets a job teaching French and German. Initially, the change of scenery seems great for Dienach, but it doesn't take long before the people of the city start to notice that something is off about this man. For instance, one of these days, Dienach is sitting in front of the Parthenon, the ruins of an ancient temple built in honor of the Greek goddess Athena. While there, a young man comes to sit beside him and makes a passing comment about how someone 2,000 years ago probably sat at the same spot where they were sitting, looking at the rock, and that if they focused only on the rock and nothing else, it could almost be like they had traveled back in time to that era, 2,000 years ago. Dienach immediately agrees with the young man's theory, but then, putting his own spin on it, Dienach adds that since the Parthenon would still be the same in 2,000 years, staring at it and forgetting everything else, it could also be like they had traveled forward in time. But then, he adds one thing that totally freaks his new friend out. After saying that the Parthenon would remain the same in 2,000 years, he says, "Except then, there will be no bars around it. They will have gotten rid of them." The seriousness and sense of absolute certainty that Dienach has around him proves too much for his new friend, so the young man awkwardly walks away from Dienach. Very likely it wasn't just this young man who found Dienach weird in Athens, but there was one man who didn't, one man who admired and respected Dienach a lot. His name was George Papahatsis, and he was a student of Dienach's. Over time, Dienach and Papahatsis would get closer and closer, and Dienach would share his life with his beloved student, except for one thing, his mysterious coma experience. Well, it probably didn't matter because Dienach was about to have bigger issues anyway. In April of 1923, 6 months after moving to Greece, Dienach's tuberculosis symptoms started to worsen significantly. At this point, Dienach is coughing a lot more than usual, and he can tell that he's not going to be around for much longer. So, he begins to put his house in order, the only unresolved issue left being his coma experience. As days turn into weeks and weeks into months, Dienach battles with whether or not to share his coma experience. Unfortunately, his mind has failed him, and he can't seem to recall correctly everything that he experienced during the coma. This troubles Dienach a lot, until one day, it all starts coming back to him. All of a sudden, it's like a huge weight has been lifted from his shoulders. Dienach is so happy and excited that even his landlady notices. He sits down to put pen to paper, and over the course of many days, he puts down his coma experience as accurately as he can remember it. What he put down on those pages is what you're about to find out. Paul Amadeus Dienach passed away in 1924, presumably due to tuberculosis, and for 50 years, his name was lost to history, until 1972, when his beloved student, George Papahatsis, published a book. This book, it turns out, is a translation of Dienach's old diary, and its contents is a chronicle of everything that happened to Dienach while he was in the second coma. Dienach had entrusted Papahatsis with the diary as practice material so Papahatsis could work on his German by translating the content of the diary into Greek. Dienach's only instruction to Papahatsis was that he could not publish the content of the diary for any reason. Well, I guess Papahatsis kind of fumbled that one, but his defiance is the reason we have this video today, so maybe there was a silver lining after all. Anyway, as Papahatsis begins to translate the diary, he finds some early entries about Dienach's heartbreak when his first love marries another man and dies soon after. The later entries, however, are where things start to get really, really strange. At first, the writing seems a little confusing, almost like Dienach was trying to say something without saying something. But then, as Dienach approaches death, he begins to write much more freely. Here's how he describes his coma experience. Hold on to your seats, because it's about to get wild. According to Dienach, on the first day of his coma, he woke up to a group of people staring down at him in a strange room. Outside of his window was a beautiful countryside with colors of blue and green blended together, and on the wall of his room, a soft pink light bounced off the crystal on the wall, giving the room an otherworldly feel. At first, Dienach begins to wonder if this is heaven, or maybe one of those planets he'd been hearing about with the intelligent alien creatures. But he finally realizes that he's in a hospital, the strangest, most beautiful hospital he's ever been in. For 9 days, Dienach is unable to leave his bed because he's in so much pain and his mind is fuzzy. But from the 10th day, Dienach finds that he's able to move around a bit. And by the 12th day, just 3 days after he first starts to move around, he feels almost completely fine. A recovery that just astounds, but not as much as his next experience in this strangely beautiful hospital. Now, up to this point, Dienach has had a bandage on his head, even though he can't recall why it's there. So when he looks into a mirror, he doesn't see much, just the bandage. But then, a few days later, the nurse unwraps his head, and Dienach sees his face in the mirror for the first time. When he does, he crumbles onto the floor, confused as he heads towards the verge of a nervous breakdown. The man staring back at him in terror from the mirror wasn't him. He had never seen this man before in his life. Who was he? Dienach gets so panicked and manic that the nurses are ordered not to go near him. Instead, he is left in the care of 2 specific physicians, the chief doctor and another doctor. As the doctors try to communicate with him, Dienach realizes that he can't make out what language they are speaking, which is odd considering Dienach's specialty in languages. He does sense that the language has a bit of an Anglo-Scandinavian blend though, but that's all he can make of it, and it really weirds him out. After a few days, Dienach finally calms down and is allowed to take walks around the facility, a place unlike anything he has ever seen in his life. For instance, there's this great hall where everything is made of crystal, and one day, Dienach is walking across this hall when he sees a group of doctors and nurses huddled together and chatting. He can't really hear them because they are whispering, and also because of the language barrier, but he can make out a few words here and there. One name that seems to be going around a lot is Andreas Nordum, which Dienach assumes to be the name of the man whose body he was in. The more Dienach listens, the more he's able to get a few more bits and pieces of the puzzle. And from what he gathers, Andreas Nordum had been involved in an accident which killed him, but then the doctors froze his brain for some minutes and were able to revive him. Well, revive in a sense because, as you and Dienach know, even though these people were looking at Andreas Nordum, Nordum had not actually come back to life. Obviously, this sounds absolutely insane, and Dienach realizes it too. So, he decides to play along and not tell anyone the secret about his true identity. Now, up to this point, Dienach still thinks he's in 1921, but while speaking to one of the doctors, he learns that he's not actually in 1921, but in 3906. This pushes Dienach again into another nervous breakdown, because unless he was the subject of an elaborate prank, not only had he switched bodies, he had also somehow jumped forward in time by 2,000 years in just one night. Dienach's new reality takes a while to sink in. I mean, psychologically he's in the year 1921, but physically he finds himself in the year 3906, and it's really conflicting for him. Perhaps it was this mental block, or maybe it was something else, but Dienach found that he could no longer fall asleep. Which is ironic when you consider that he got into this mysterious situation as a result of an illness that caused mysterious sleep. Anyway, shortly after Dienach found out whose body he was in and what year it was, he is taken to meet a group of people called the Lectors. The Lectors are spiritual leaders with a royal and priestly aura to them, and when Dienach sees them, he immediately falls on his face, sobbing and confessing, opening up about his past and the truth of who he really is. The men seem empathetic, but they don't do much to help Dienach except to say some stuff about reality and human cognition that Dienach didn't really get. After meeting the Lectors and confessing his true identity to them, Dienach meets Andreas Nordum's mentor, Jaeger, as well as his best friend, Stefan. The two men teach Dienach a lot of things about the future and introduce him to a box that turns words into pictures and sound so he could learn even more. Which kinda sounds like our modern-day iPad, doesn't it? Anyway, this device, called the Reagan Swage, is what Dienach uses to learn about the past, or our future. Dienach is allowed to learn as much as he wants about all the centuries leading up to 3906, With one exception, he couldn't learn about the 20th century. Yeager felt that Dienach knowing about a past that he could be in a position to change might be bad for the timeline. By the way, just to clarify, both Yeager and Stefan knew the truth about Dienach's identity. Now here's what Dienach learned about our future. First, humans are going to have a very difficult 3 centuries, from 2000 to 2300. During this time, humans will struggle with overpopulation and lots of international conflicts. In the middle of this, we will still continue to record astronomical achievements, and quite literally too, because we colonize Mars in 2024. And for 60 long years after that, the human colony on Mars will grow to 22 million. Unfortunately, a massive impact event would hit Mars, wiping out the entire human colony on it. And because of that, humans will not attempt to colonize Mars or any other planet for a very long time. By 2309, humans will experience a medium-scale war that will last for 80 years. This war will annihilate the human population, especially Europe. Only the Baltic and Scandinavian countries will survive, perhaps explaining why the language in 3906 had an Anglo-Scandinavian blend. Anyway, after the nuclear war, by 2396, the human population would be in aggressive decline until a new world government rises up and ends the global war, marking the beginning of a new history for the human race. This new world government will eventually prove to be very corrupt though, as it will mostly be run by oligarchs. So for 200 years, people will resist this government until it eventually falls and the business of governance is moved to the thinkers, humanitarians, and scientists. Once again, this will mark a new beginning for humanity. Now, following that, for the next 300 years, mankind will undergo a massive societal reform, shifting from a scarcity-based economic system to an adequacy-based system. In other words, people will start working for the greater good rather than working to accumulate wealth. At first, people will work for 40 years and then retire, after which the global community will look after them. But by the time Dienach arrives in 3906 AD, people only have to work for 2 years in a compulsory program called a service. The service begins at age 17 after a person has completed their education and ends at age 19 when they retire and then pursue whatever life they want. Sure, you could work. The man whose body Dienach was in, for instance, was a physicist. But at this point in history, money isn't exactly in use anymore, as people now see value in art and science rather than in material possessions. So as long as you complete your service years, you don't need to ever worry about money again. But what about human greed? Do humans just stop being greedy and develop perfect contentment in 2,000 years? Well, it sounds like we do. According to Dienach's diary, around the year 3000, something called the Nebelbirch happens. And this event comes with a new spiritual ability called the Oversen or Supersen. It's an ability that makes it possible for mankind to tap into the vast reservoir of spiritual knowledge. Which sounds great until you find out that everyone who experienced the Nebelbirch when it first happened died. The strong rush of emotions proved too much for them, and so their bodies succumbed. In 3382 though, the first man survives the Nebelbirch, and then from then on, everyone starts surviving it, which leads to the evolution of a new species of man called the Homo occidentalis novus, or the New Western Man. Because human nature essentially changes thanks to the Nebelbirch, there will be no need for laws in the future. Everyone works for the common good, and all the centuries leading up to that enlightenment will be viewed as the Dark Ages. Speaking of human nature, Dienach observed that people of 3906 had a peculiarity about them. They seemed like carefree children, with no single worry in the world, and this made him wonder how they planned to survive if they received an external threat from, say, aliens. Well, as it turns out, they had already met with aliens plenty of times, and the encounters turned out to be quite pleasant. One day, Stefan decides to take Dienach to a super city called Norfer, which obviously did not exist in 1921, and still does not exist today. According to Dienach's account, Norfer was the 4th largest city in the world, and people described the place as a fairy tale land. In that city, Dienach saw many mansions as tall as mountains, a lake shore that was lined with synthetic marble, hanging gardens, floating shops, floating observatories, floating lounges, and vast underground cities. This probably sounds unimpressive to you, being born in a generation where sci-fi movies are a dime a dozen, but keep in mind that Dienach lived in an era where sci-fi movies were hardly a thing. Movies hadn't even started talking in Dienach's time, yet Dienach is mentioning inventions that sound a lot like 3D movies and jumbotrons. Anyway, being highly interested in philosophical matters, Dienach obviously loves his new life in 3906 AD, with the heightened spiritual enlightenment and the deep thinkers he gets to interact with. Then one day, he decides it's time for him to take a spiritual journey to a place known as the Valley of Roses, the spiritual center of the city, home to the spiritual elite who had dedicated their lives to the study of philosophy and science. Guided by his friend Stefan, Dienach visits the Valley of Roses on a flying boat, and the place is everything you'd imagine it to be. Completely otherworldly, with shimmering lights, beautiful flower bushes, magnificent temples and monuments, and precious stones everywhere. Dienach instantly falls in love with this place and spends the next few weeks there. Sadly, the longer Dienach stays there, the more yearnings for his old life start to rush over him, getting stronger and stronger with each passing day. Specifically, Dienach is hit with a strong wave of nostalgia for his first love, Anna, which leads us to another wild experience that Dienach has while in Andreas Nordum's body. For context, as a young man, Dienach met and fell in love with a girl from his village named Anna. Unfortunately, things didn't quite turn out as they'd both hoped, as Anna's family forced her to marry another man, and she even died soon after that. But now, just before Anna got married, on one of those evenings, Anna and Dienach went up a hill to spend one last time together. After sharing a few beautiful hours, Anna decides it's time for them to go back. But just before they leave, Dienach makes Anna promise him that he would see her again. Anna agrees. In fact, she goes further to promise him that the next time they did, she would make a wreath from the windflowers on the hill where they sat, and she'd give it to him to put on her head. Now, here's where it gets crazy. In 3906, as Andreas Nordum, Dienach starts a relationship with a girl named Sylvia. One day, nearly a year after Dienach first wakes up in the future, the two decide to go on a day trip to Dienach's old village, although Sylvia doesn't know that this is where they are going. When they get there, they spend many hours touring the place, and then end up on a hill where they share a picnic. And that's when the most curious thing happens. After spending a couple of hours on the hill, Sylvia decides that it's time to leave, but then she picks up some windflowers, makes them into a wreath, and then gives them to Dienach to place on her head. The simple act throws Dienach aback for a second. This is exactly what Anna promised she'd do the next time they saw each other. Could Anna have switched bodies and time traveled to 3906 too? Did she really not die? Dienach is still pondering this when he gets back from their day trip, so he shares his weird experience with Sylvia with Stefan. In response, Stefan explains that time isn't linear, and that Sylvia was very likely Anna's reincarnated soul that traveled through time to fulfill her promise. Before you scoff, here's something I didn't mention at first. When Dienach first met Sylvia, Stefan had explained to him that Andreas Nordum had been in love with Sylvia since forever, but that Sylvia didn't love him in return. So how come Sylvia, who felt nothing for Nordum before, suddenly started feeling something for him when Dienach's consciousness started living in his body? This has to be evidence for reincarnation, right? Anyway, as Dienach ponders on that realization, he slowly starts to feel drowsy for the first time since he woke up in 3906 AD. How he managed to stay awake for a whole year beats me, but slowly and gently, his eyelids flutter and then they close, and then he falls asleep. By the time Dienach wakes up, he's back in the 20th century and back to his old body. Now, I know what you're thinking. This story is too incredible to be real. But hold that sentiment and think about it for just a second. Many of Dienach's predictions turned out to be eerily accurate. I mean, the diary entries talk about how the 21st century would be shaped by agricultural and environmental problems, the rise of individualism, the abolition of human rights, and the very real threat of nuclear weapons. Dienach also mentioned something about colonizing Mars, flying vehicles, holographic technology, and making contact with alien life. You don't need me to tell you that these predictions have turned out to be super accurate so far, especially for a man living in the early 1920s. This was a time before World War II and the consequent boom in scientific research and discovery. In fact, the Manhattan Project, which kickstarted research into the development of nuclear weapons, hadn't even started at that point, and wouldn't start until about 20 years from then. So, Paul shouldn't have known what nuclear weapons are, let alone how they would pose an existential threat to humans in the 21st century. He shouldn't have even had the raw materials in his brain to cook up such fantastic recollections. On the surface of it, at least, there's simply no way else to explain Dienach's predictions, other than that he actually lived in the future like he claimed. Except, maybe this was just a false memory? I'll explain with a true-life story. On New Year's Day in 2012, a 29-year-old man, Alpha Kabija, was cycling down a street in North London to go see his girlfriend and apologize to her for attending a New Year's Eve party without her. Unfortunately, Kabija would never make it to her house because he would get knocked down by a van. Though Kabija's body only showed minor signs of injuries, Kabija wasn't wearing his helmet that day, so when University College London Hospital carried out a CT scan, they found that Kabija's brain was not only bleeding, but had actually shifted in his skull. To save his brain, the doctors would induce a coma so that the surgeons could remove some parts of his brain in order to reduce the swelling. Thankfully, the surgery was successful, and after 3 weeks, Kabija finally woke up from his coma. When Kabija came to, contrary to the doctor's expectations, he could remember everything about himself. In fact, he had even acquired some new memories. For instance, he recalled going to see his girlfriend, who was pregnant with their twins, the picture of the ultrasound he had put in his notebook, and the names they had agreed to give them, Sky and Nikita. Kabija also recalled cycling to the MI6 for a job interview with a man named Michael Mitchells, and even owning a private jet. The only issue was none of these things actually happened. So what's that about? Well, when most of us think of memory and remembering, we imagine that our brains store occurrences neatly like a video camera, and then pull out the necessary files when we need them. But that's not really how memories work. According to memory scientists, memories are more like mental constructions than tape recordings or books on a shelf, and autobiographical memories especially are very flexible, constructive, and reconstructive. For instance, a study published by Julia Shaw in Psychological Science in January 2015 showed that 70% of test subjects came to falsely believe that they had committed a serious crime as teenagers. And not just that, these subjects could even provide very vivid details of these non-events, all on the basis of 3 interviews in which Shaw employed suggestive memory retrieval techniques. As Shaw explains, a memory is a compressed, edited, and sometimes embellished version of an event, bolstered by the network of connections it makes in our brains. Memories that don't stick with us are ones that have fewer network connections. Later, when we retrieve the memory, the editing process continues as we shape the memory into a coherent story and form new network connections that serve new purposes. Its realness as a memory isn't a function of it corresponding to actual events as they occurred, but rather in what it means to the memory maker. Which means that our memories are more subjective than we like to think. But here's the thing. Sometimes this network of connections can become distorted. It happens on a smaller scale to people with healthy, uninjured brains, but happens on a much larger scale to people with brain injuries or brain trauma. Especially in the case of a coma or a loss of consciousness, the brain tries to make sense of the confusing time gap, and then resorts to filling the gap with fictional memories. This is what happened with Kabija. With Kabija, the raw material for his fictional memories came from his subconscious. Before his accident, Kabija had a girlfriend, some of his friends were having kids, twins ran in his family, he once applied for a position at MI6 some years before his accident, and just recently, he had seen a movie that featured the plane he remembered owning. So in other words, the building blocks for his fictional memories were in his head somewhere. His brain just had to find them and stack them on top of one another when it couldn't make sense of the time Kabija lost during his 3-week coma. For Dienach, before his coma, he had been interested in philosophy and the humanities, so long after the coma, when Dienach's brain couldn't explain the time gap, it probably just used these building blocks supplied by his subconscious to create memories of a utopian future, where everyone was spiritually inclined and heavily invested in philosophy. Well, that's definitely one way to look at it, but a more accurate way to look at this story is probably that the entire thing is just a work of fiction. Hear me out. There's this book called The Shadow Out of Time written by H.P. Lovecraft in the 1930s, and some say that this book might have been the inspiration for the Paul Amadeus Dienach story. For instance, the protagonist of The Shadow Out of Time also slips into a coma and then wakes up in a different timeline. Well, he wakes up in the past while Dienach wakes up in the future, but it's still coma and time travel. Anyway, it's possible that, inspired by this story, George Papahatsis decided to write a narrative treatise on human spirituality using time travel and romance as plot devices. A quick search on George Papahatsis reveals that he was an intellectual with deep interest in the humanities, and as you may have noticed, this was a major theme running throughout Dienach's recollection of his time in the future. So, it's possible that the Paul Amadeus Dienach story was just a work of fiction, not intended to be received as factual. Besides, the claim that Paul Amadeus Dienach lived in the town of Zurich in the 1920s and then taught in Athens in that same time period turns out to be shaky at best. Even at that time, both cities had records of people living and working in them, and neither has any record of a Paul Amadeus Dienach. In his book, George Papahatsis mentions that Dienach fought for Germany during World War I, after which he changed his name and moved to Switzerland. In other words, Paul Amadeus Dienach was probably not his real name, but this seems a little too convenient. Another thing that's a little too convenient is the fact that Dienach's original handwritten diary somehow got lost. According to Papahatsis, Greek military officials seized the diary from him when they raided his home and found that the diary was written in German. The problem, however, is that if this is true, then why doesn't Paul Amadeus Dienach exist? And why are there no German sources for the existence of this man, who is supposed to be Swiss? Instead, all the sources for Paul Amadeus Dienach are Greek and date back to the 60s rather than the 20s. Even the picture being passed around as the picture of Paul Amadeus Dienach is another hoax. It's actually a mugshot of a very photogenic criminal in New Zealand, Daniel Tohill, which destroys the last and final paper trail for this so-called Paul Amadeus Dienach. Honestly, this feels like the Princess Bride novel, which claims to be an abridged version of an older novel that doesn't actually exist. In fact, someone pointed out that prior to the book being published by George Papahatsis in 1972, the basic plot of the book was laid out in a series of articles published in a Greek magazine called Parnassos, which means that the diary never existed. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Is the Paul Amadeus Dienach story true or not? Well, I guess we'd have to wait until 3906 to find out. In the meantime, there are actually more convincing stories of time travel than that of Paul Amadeus Dienach. In 2006, a time traveler from the year 1958 appeared in Kiev, Ukraine, and this one brought tangible proof, including photos. Be sure to check it out.